Hello and welcome to a new use case on how to build the future of work with Tap Studio. In today's video we will scan a few invoices to extract accounting data and then export them in an Excel worksheet. Rename the sequence Get Invoice, the transition Start Transition, and let's access it. To define the folder path where the invoices are, let's create a string variable source path. Add an assign value activity, set the variable source path as input, and the output as the folder path. Don't forget to double the backslash in order for the robot to use it as a simple string character, not as a meta character. Next, create a variable invoice list which is an array of strings. Here we will store the invoice file names. Add a new assign value activity, set the variable invoice list as input and the output as the C# expression directory.get files that accepts two filters. The path, in this case the variable source path. And a filter, we can just set a wildcard between quotes, meaning to consider all files within folder invoices, but for a more robust automation, let's filter only the PDF files. Create a new int32 variable, number invoices, where we will store the total number of PDF files within the invoices folder. Add a new assign value activity, set the variable number invoices as input and the output as invoice_list.count. This means that we apply the C# method count to the array variable invoice list to get the number of elements. Let's add a message box activity for test purposes. The output is at the source path, and there are number invoices to be processed. Now let's run the workflow to test. The output is correct, so we can remove the message box and go back to the main page. Add a new sequence, set a transition between Get Invoice and it and rename it. Also rename the new sequence, extract invoice data, and access it. Add a Start Process activity. The process name is msedge.x, which means Microsoft Edge. Because we want to open the PDF invoices in the browser, the argument must be an URL having the format file / folder path file name .pdf. Given the invoice file name convention inv-00000 invoice counter, only the last digit in the file name needs to be changed. Copy the file URL and paste it in the arguments field between quotes. Create an int32 variable, invoice counter, having a default value of 1, and replace in arguments the value 1 with invoice counter. Let's test the workflow one more time, to make sure the invoice is open in Microsoft Edge. And it works perfectly. Next let's add a wait for control activity. You might wonder why we need wait for control. Because it takes around 2 seconds for Microsoft Edge to open the invoice, and the default wait time before the extract text activity would run is 150 milliseconds. In other words, the robot would search for the PDF invoice control identifier to extract text from, but it would not find it while the browser is still loading. Press the plus button to define the control identifier and select the whole MS Edge page. Rename the control identifier invoice_Ms Edge. To fine-tune the identifier, replace window caption with a wild card, same as the text property from the main window and second window. As a best practice, use highlight control to make sure the control identifier is still recognized after fine-tuning. Next we will start to add extract text activities. To extract the invoice number, or any other info, first we define an anchor in order for the OCR to be able to extract the info of interest. A good anchor is always at the same vertical or horizontal distance to the info to be extracted. In this case, the anchor is invoice number. This is the confirmation the anchor is set, and the next step is to define the info to be extracted. To store the extracted data, let's create a string variable, invoice number, and set it as output. Add a message box activity and set a descriptive output, in order to test the invoice number was extracted correctly. Next, add a new extract text activity to extract the customer name. First we define the anchor, bill to, and then the area from where to extract the customer name. You might have noticed the area set is longer than the actual customer name. That's because we want to make sure the automation is robust enough to extract the customer name, no matter how long it is. To store the extracted data, let's create a string variable, customer name, and set it as output. Add a message box activity and set a descriptive output, in order to test the customer name was extracted correctly. Next, add a new extract text activity to extract the invoice date. To store the extracted data, let's create a string variable, invoice date, and set it as output. Add a message box activity and set a descriptive output, in order to test the invoice date was extracted correctly. Next, add a new extract text activity to extract the invoice due date. To store the extracted data, let's create a string variable, invoice due date, and set it as output. Add a message box activity and set a descriptive output, in order to test the invoice due date was extracted correctly. Next, add a new extract text activity to extract the purchase order number. To store the extracted data, let's create a string variable, PO number, and set it as output. Add a message box activity and set a descriptive output, in order to test the PO number was extracted correctly. Next, add a new extract text activity to extract the invoiced service name. To store the extracted data, let's create a string variable, service name, and set it as output. Add a message box activity and set a descriptive output, in order to test the service name was extracted correctly. Next, add a new extract text activity to extract the invoiced amount to be invoiced. To store the extracted data, let's create a string variable, invoice amount, and set it as output. Add a message box activity and set a descriptive output, in order to test the invoice amount was extracted correctly. Let's run the workflow and test the current automation. It works perfectly. Now let's go back to the main page and add a new sequence, rename it Excel and set the transition from extract invoice data to it. Let's open the Excel and add a new variable, invoice W sheet. The variable type is Excel document. Add a Open Excel worksheet activity and set the newly created variable in the input field Excel document. The document path is the same path where the invoice files are located plus the document name. As the Excel document invoice report doesn't exist, it will be created. In this Excel report we will export the extracted invoice data. Add a set cell value activity to add the invoice number. The Excel document is invoice W sheet. The worksheet number is 1, which means the first sheet of invoice report.xlsx is invoice counter having currently the value 1. The column number is also 1, meaning the first column. The output is the variable invoice number. Add a new set cell value activity to add the customer name. The Excel document is invoice W sheet. The row is invoice counter, column number is 2, and the output is the variable customer name. Add a new set cell value activity to add the invoice date. The Excel document is invoice W sheet. The row is invoice counter, column number is 3, and the output is the variable invoice date. Add a new set cell value activity to add the invoice due date. The Excel document is invoice W sheet. The row is invoice counter, column number is 4, and the output is the variable invoice due date. Add a new set cell value activity to add the purchase order number. The Excel document is invoice W sheet. The row is invoice counter, column number is 5, and the output is the variable PO number. Add a new set cell value activity to add the name of service to be invoiced. The Excel document is invoice W sheet. The row is invoice counter, column number is 6, and the output is the variable service name. Add a new set cell value activity to add the invoice total amount. The Excel document is invoice W sheet. The row is invoice counter, column number is 7, and the output is the variable invoice amount. Let's add a final set cell value activity to add the invoice file name. The Excel document is invoice W sheet. The row is invoice counter, column number is 8, and the output is invoice list of invoice counter -1. This expression calls the invoice list array and gets the element from position invoice counter -1. Why -1? Because invoice counter has the initial value 1 and will be incremented, while the counter of arrays and lists elements starts from 0. To save the changes in invoice report.xlsx, add a close Excel workbook activity. The Excel document is invoice W sheet and we have to set the parameter save changes to true. Let's go back to the main page and add a new sequence. Open it and add an assign value activity. Rename it new invoice. The input is invoice counter and the output is invoice counter +1 in order to increment the invoice number and Excel row. Go to the main page, and set the transition from the Excel sequence to it. Add a new sequence, the actual end state, and rename it. Set a transition from new invoice to end sequence and rename it, and then set another one from new invoice to extract invoice data and rename this sequence too. Currently new invoice is the starting point for two transitions. As per state machine convention, there cannot be two transitions without condition. This is why it is very important to set conditions to each of the two transitions in order to have the robot know what's the next state from next invoice. After incrementing invoice counter by the assign value activity from next invoice, its value is still smaller than number invoice +1. Then transition 5 is selected and the robot goes again to sequence extract invoice data to process the next invoice. Otherwise the robot will follow the end sequence and finish the execution. In the end sequence, let's add a message box in order to inform when the automation project runs successfully. Now we are all set. Let's run the project. Extracting the data from the first invoice. And from the second one. And now for the third and last one. And it ran successfully. Let's open the Excel report to check if all invoice info was extracted correctly. Everything looks good. All data extracted is in its place. Thank you very much for watching.